Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This essay is not an exploration of shame as an emotion, but as a framework for existence. It is not a guide for overcoming or healing in the conventional sense, but a reckoning with how deeply shame structures what we believe about worth, presence, and identity. Across these pages, you will not find a redemptive arc, a conclusive solution, or a triumphant exit. Instead, you will find the slow recursive process of deconstructing internal architecture built on compliance, erasure, and survival. This piece invites the reader to sit with that process, its grief, its resistance, and its reorientation towards something quieter, less heroic, and more true. They never named it. That's how you know it's structural. Shame wasn't something that happened to them. It was the scaffolding into which their personality was poured, like concrete into a mold designed by someone else's discomfort. Psychologically, this structure resembles a formative blueprint, early attachments and social cues instructing the developing self on which parts are safe to express and which parts must be sealed off to maintain the illusion of acceptability. The architecture of their identity wasn't improvised. It was engineered by the need to avoid rejection. Before they ever told a lie, wanted too much, or got something wrong, shame had already arranged the furniture in the room of their becoming. This isn't just about childhood trauma or toxic relationships. It's about what's assumed before story even begins, that your presence comes with a surcharge, that love must be earned by deletion. That attention is dangerous unless negotiated through excellence, obedience, or silence. This is not shame as feeling, this is shame as ontology. The distinction is quiet but seismic. If shame is just a feeling, it can be processed, reframed, even healed. But if shame is woven into the foundation of being, if it arrives before language, before memory, then it becomes the ground from which all thought and action emerge. It no longer says, I feel ashamed, it says, I am the kind of person who is shameful. This is not about episodic discomfort. It's about the terms on which a person believes they are allowed to exist. Cognitive behavioral therapy might resist this framing. From its perspective, such identity-level conclusions are distortions, learned beliefs that can be unlearned. CBT would encourage questioning the evidence, reframing the thought, rerouting the response, and often that work is powerful. But ontological shame resists evidence. It doesn't live in cognition. It lives beneath it, in the assumptions that shape what counts as evidence in the first place. Before a person can reframe a thought, they must first believe they are worthy of a different frame. And when shame operates at the level of being, that belief is not merely unavailable, it's unthinkable. So healing doesn't begin with logic, it begins with dissonance. A pause before apologizing, a refusal to shrink, a moment of feeling misaligned with the script, even if you can't yet name the script itself. That dissonance is not clarity, but it's a beginning. A crack in the surface, a splinter in the floorboards, enough to let light in, enough to wonder if survival has always required disappearance, enough to ask quietly, carefully, what else might be possible. You see it in the patterns that repeat without explanation. The way someone gravitates toward partners who make them feel invisible, or chooses jobs that demand their self-erasure in exchange for approval. They say they don't know why they do it, but on some level, they do. There's a script older than memory that tells them they are safest in roles that confirm their unworthiness. To be overlooked is painful but familiar. To be diminished is unjust but predictable. And predictability can feel like safety when chaos was the first teacher. There's even a kind of dignity in it, a rehearsed nobility in endurance. If you are the one who carries, who bends, who doesn't ask, at least you are not the one who breaks. If you're not allowed to be fully seen, then perhaps you can be selectively admired for your strength, your composure, your quiet. This isn't just coping. It's choreography, a way of moving through the world that makes shame feel like a compass. And when the world applauds this pattern, calling it resilience, selflessness, professionalism, it becomes harder to see it for what it is, survival wearing the costume of virtue. This is shame not as a private emotion, but as an inherited operating system, a subtle script passed down through family dynamics, institutions, and culture. It's internalized so completely that it no longer feels imposed. It feels natural, expected, rational. You don't even call it shame, you call it being good. being useful, being chosen, and you don't question the cost until the body starts to tremble at praise, until rest feels irresponsible, until being alone with yourself feels like exposure. Only then does the system begin to flicker. Only then does the question begin to surface: who taught me that existing this way was the only safe way to exist? And it works. That's the trap. The shame-formed self can achieve, impress, seduce, protect. It can become the model employee, the caretaker, the one who always knows how to read a room. It's functional, rewarded even, but it cannot rest. It cannot enter a space without scanning for threat, some cue that confirms its deepest suspicion that it does not belong. It cannot receive love without translating it into performance. Affection becomes something to earn. Vulnerability becomes something to manage. Intimacy becomes a transaction governed by unspoken rules. And in this way, shame is not a wound to be healed. It is a system to be interrupted. The logic is recursive. Shame teaches the self to preempt hurt by self-editing, to stay safe by staying small. Over time, this becomes reflexive. You stop noticing the decisions you make to avoid being too much. You confuse withholding with maturity. You confuse detachment with stability. Eventually, you forget there was ever an alternative. The internal choreography is so well rehearsed that it doesn't feel like constraint, it feels like character. Ontology becomes choreography. The terms of being become the steps you repeat without question. And healing, if it ever arrives, does not feel like triumph. It feels like betrayal, because it requires a refusal of that choreography, a willingness to do things badly, to say the unfiltered thing, to risk being seen in ways that were once dangerous. That betrayal is not of others. It's of the logic that once kept you safe. And that's where the process begins, not with transformation, but with treason, not with clarity, but with a disruption so quiet it almost gets missed, a missed apology, a withheld justification, a breath held a little longer before the performance starts again. There's a moment in every process of unlearning when the self begins to rebel against its own architecture. It's not dramatic, it's a flicker, a pause before smoothing over discomfort, a refusal to shoulder blame that isn't yours, a sentence that leaves your mouth without pre-editing for likability. In that brief act of disobedience, something old trembles. Because shame doesn't just disappear, it adapts, it shifts forms, it presents as modesty, humility, even wisdom. It wears the costume of virtue so convincingly that even when you think you've escaped it, it's still in the room, sitting at the table, speaking through your voice. Psychologically, this is efficiency. The brain favors the familiar, even if it harms you. Patterns that ensured safety in early environments become default settings in adulthood, not because they are true, but because they were once necessary. The nervous system, trained by unpredictability, will prefer a known pain to an unknown calm. And shame, refined through repetition, becomes the language your body uses to orient itself. You don't just fear disappointment, you expect it. You don't just anticipate withdrawal, you preempt it, performing the diminishment before anyone else has the chance to request it. This is why growth can feel like grief. To loosen the choreography of shame is to lose a version of yourself that worked, that kept you out of danger, that earned you praise, that made you legible to systems that reward self-erasure with survival. And yet something in you begins to question the cost. Not because you know what comes next, but because the current script no longer fits. The choices it offers, disappear or perform, begin to feel too small for what you suspect might be possible. And that suspicion is sacred. It's not yet a belief, but it's more than a doubt. It's the moment light enters through a hairline crack in a structure you didn't know could be questioned. You won't want to believe it. You'll want to explain it away. But it's there, fragile, persistent, a signal that the internal border patrol isn't absolute, that there may be a life, however quiet or partial, on the other side of obedience. But this reorientation comes at a cost. To betray the logic of shame is to risk the collapse of the self it constructed. When survival has been secured through performance, stillness can feel like exposure. When worth has been measured in usefulness, rest can feel like irrelevance. And when relationships have been maintained through compliance, authenticity can feel like rupture. Healing, in this sense, is not a gentle ascent. It is a destabilization, a deconstruction. Sometimes even a loss. To name survival as surrender can fracture the identity built around endurance. You may begin to see how your roles, peacemaker, achiever, fixer, weren't expressions of character, but adaptations to atmospheres that demanded your erasure. And in recognizing that, the ground can shake. People around you might resist the shift. They were familiar with the version of you that never asked for much, that anticipated needs, that made everything easier. When that version recedes, friction rises. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've interrupted a dynamic that depended on your silence. Even within yourself, doubt multiplies. If I'm not this reliable, competent, likable container for other people's comfort, then who am I? The old narrative, corrosive as it was, provided coherence, predictability, structure. Without it, there is only suspension, not yet belonging to the new, no longer protected by the old. This in-between is tender and dangerous. It is where shame surges most violently, begging you to retreat to the known choreography. But you don't, or not every time. You stay, you tremble. You speak when silence was safer. You rest when apology was expected. You start small, quiet acts of resistance that no one may notice. But your nervous system does. Your internal cartographer, so long trained to map around danger, begins to sketch new terrain. Not free of shame, but no longer governed by it. Not immune to collapse, but no longer living in anticipation of it. This is not healing as victory. It is healing as interruption, and that is enough. But healing doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with doubt, the kind that doesn't spiral but lingers, the kind that whispers, not screams. A quiet disbelief in the necessity of your own diminishment, not yet a belief in your worth, but a hesitation around your unworthiness. That's the fissure, the first deviation. Not a new self, but a loosened one. Not clarity, but a crack in the lens shame used to shape the world. Therapy, when it works, doesn't hand you answers. It creates space to hear the questions you've been avoiding, not the big existential ones, but the small interior ones. What happens if I stop apologizing? What if I don't fill the silence? What if I let someone care for me and don't pay them back with performance? These aren't hypotheticals, they're tectonic shifts, because to live those questions is to defy the entire structure shame built, to allow presence without justification, to allow love without strategy, to allow selfhood without spectacle. And when you stay quiet instead of self-effacing, when you express a need instead of preempting its rejection, the shame script panics. It contorts, it insists you've done something wrong, that people will leave, that punishment is coming. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes nothing happens, or something gentle does. And in that moment, the system falters, the pattern loses precision. A new logic, one not authored by fear, begins to emerge. This isn't a transformation, it's a recalibration, an unlearning of reflexes, a realignment of internal rhythms. Each time you choose not to disappear, you rewrite a line of code, not by force, not with fanfare, but through repetition, through the slow, deliberate accumulation of moments where you remain, and over time those moments become memory, then muscle, then self. Not the one shame formed, but the one shame never anticipated, the one that can stay, speak, rest, the one that belongs. There's no finish line, no final arrival where shame evaporates and the self stands clean and whole. What there is instead is recalibration, over and over again, a continual reorientation toward a life that doesn't require constant self-surveillance. And each small shift matters. Each refusal to collapse, each moment of stillness in the face of urgency, each boundary held without apology, these are not accessories to healing. They are healing. Not because they fix the past, but because they loosen its grip on the present. And in that loosening, something profound happens. The shame that once seemed like the foundation of your being becomes recognizable as a narrative, a story. A script someone else started writing long before you had language, and one you've been performing ever since. It may have been useful, it may have protected you, but it's not sacred, and it's not yours to finish. You begin to see that not every discomfort requires self-correction. Not every silence is a test. Not every withdrawal is a reflection of your worth. You no longer read every room for danger. You begin instead to notice your own presence in it, not as a liability, not as a disruption, but as something neutral, even at times something valuable. That doesn't mean the old patterns vanish. Shame will still knock, it will still whisper, it will still test the doors. but it no longer holds the keys. Its voice might still echo, but your nervous system is learning a new dialect. One doesn't equate stillness with threat, one that doesn't confuse rest with irrelevance, one that doesn't read love as an impending loss. And in this learning, you start to believe, not all at once, but enough, that the story of shame doesn't have to be the story of you. It can be one of the stories, a chapter, a system you inhabited, but not the name you carry. Not the logic that governs you, not the reason you shrink in rooms too small for your becoming. Eventually, you stop waiting for someone to name your worth. You stop performing usefulness to justify your place in the room. You stop treating life like an audition for conditional belonging. This shift doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't announce itself with triumph. It arrives quietly in refusals. You decline the script. You don't chase the correction. You walk away, not in protest, but in peace. What follows is not revelation, but unfamiliar stillness. No need to earn stillness. No demand to interpret it. Just space, undecorated, unproven. At first, it feels like absence, like something missing. But in time, that absence becomes permission, a place where the self no longer asks to be redeemed, where identity doesn't require revision, where you don't have to distill your pain into insight for it to matter. You don't have to transform it into wisdom for it to be real. And there is grief here, yes, for time lost, for selves abandoned, for truth spoken too late. But there is also a quiet fidelity to complexity, to incompletion, to the strange unfolding rhythm of a life no longer tethered to the need to be palatable. You begin to live in first draft, in process. You contradict yourself. You change your mind. You stay near what feels honest, even when it's hard to explain. You notice who stays, not out of obligation, but out of resonance. And when they leave, you no longer twist yourself into new shapes to make them stay. You remain. No grand arrival, no end to the recursion, just presence. Just a life, unproofed, unperformed, unafraid to begin again. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.